We'll now begin the questions and answers session following the roundtable discussion on session 1 and session 2. And I'm going to invite questions from the floor, and you'll notice that there are roaming mics as per usual, and the facilitators will sort of, as usual, draw the attention of our staff holding the mics. So basically all I want to say, and I can be very repetitive, and you're going to hear this several times today, I want to remind you to keep instructions and questions as brief as possible so that we can make the best use of our time. All right, so hands up. This is table 4.
Good morning. I'm the facilitator at table 4, and the citizens at this table have 3 questions. First one is, how much support is needed to initiate a bill for a referendum? The second one is, does a question on a ballot paper have to be a yes or a no answer, or is there a possibility for a third or fourth option? And the third question is there a provision or mechanism in Ireland that would allow an ordinary citizen to propose a bill to amend the Constitution, or does that privilege only lie with members of the Oireachtas?
Yeah. A lot of those questions will relate to matters which we'll be dealing with later in the day, but maybe we deal with question 1. I presume you mean what type of majority is necessary to pass a bill? Is that basically what you're asking?
To initiate it.
To initiate a bill?
Yeah, so how does it get on the agenda?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. How does it get on the agenda in the Dáil?
Well, bills can be initiated by either the government or the opposition, and then it works its way through both Dáil, Seanad, and back to the Dáil again, and basically just needs a majority in the Dáil.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that.
Yeah,
But we have opposition bills.
Yeah.
As long as an opposition bill was taken and the Oireachtas as a whole agree to a bill, it will be will be passed. This is much more important nowadays, of course, when we have a minority government, and you significantly minority government. But yeah, that's how it works.
Yeah. Does that explain it sufficiently for you? Because there have been a lot of private members' bills in relation to amending the Constitution in the very recent past.
There is an article in the Constitution, if I could just find it here, which might explain it pretty quickly. Is Article 28.4.1, the government shall be responsible to Dáil Éireann. And so the idea is that if Dáil Éireann agrees to a bill in a vote, that bill will be passed by the Oireachtas. So it's the idea of the Oireachtas passing a bill as distinct from the government. Is that okay?
You're happy with that? Yeah.
Do you want to?
The binary yes, no answer. Doesn't have to be yes, no answer. Like under the Constitution currently, it is. Maybe Niamh will cover that.
Yes. Niamh, can you deal with the second question?
Yes.
The yes or no, the binary.
Yes, I think that is right. I'm just looking for the section, and I can come back to you, but as far as I'm aware, it's a yes or no. There isn't an interim answer, if you like.
Yeah.
And we mean the Constitution, so like.
Yeah. And we'll probably be going there later in the day as well. And then the matter of the citizens' initiative, it isn't provided for in the 1937 Constitution, but again, it's something we're going to be talking about later today. Do either of you want to make any observation on that?
No, I would agree with your last point.
Yeah. Very good. Table 5.
Thank you, Judge. I'm the facilitator at Table 5. Some of the citizens at this table had a question for Professor Gary Murphy. And the question was, in terms of the alteration of university representation in the Seanad, why was it not implemented, and what are the issues?
So I'll just try and get the article up here. So the referendum took place, and the article as it now reads says, provision may be made by law for the election on a franchise and in the manner to be provided by law by one of the more of the following institutions, namely the universities mentioned in the subsection 1 and any other institutions of higher education in the state. So while the referendum was passed and the article was amended, no effect has been given to the amendment. So the current situation pertains that in those university seats, only NUI graduates and Trinity graduates have a vote. There's 3 NUI seats and 3 Trinity seats. There have been, in many ways, untold reports, I think at least 13, about amending the Seanad, and it has just proved extraordinarily difficult because I'm not sure their political will exists. And of course we had a referendum to abolish the Seanad, which was defeated. I think one of the issues about university representation is that it is not a matter which concerns the people as a whole. I mean, so in other words, those who don't have university degrees, and many of us have very little buy-in to that particular amendment, and I think that's why there has been no great political urgency to give effect to the amendment of the Constitution from the result of the original referendum back in 1979.
Yeah, so effectively, the amendment which was given effect to required legislation subsequently.
And that hasn't happened.
And it hasn't happened. Yeah. Yes, table 6.
Good morning, Judge and the panel. I'm the facilitator for table number 6. Citizens have 2 questions. The first question is, if a controversial referendum is passed or rejected, there's a concern at the citizens at table 6 that the supporters of the losing side would seek to appeal or have a second referendum on that topic. And they gave the example of the Brexit vote in England, for example. What the citizens wanted to know was, should there be a minimum period for a result to stand before it can be voted upon again? And the second question, it's somewhat similar to the NUI question of the last table. The table noted that there was a referendum 79 regarding the NUI voting and was never implemented. They want to know what the panel's comments on the pros and cons of setting a time limit to implement a decision of a referendum.
Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah. Niamh.
So just in relation to that first question, whether there should be a minimum period for the result to stand, in the Jordan case that I mentioned, interestingly enough, one of the judges, when they were rejecting the claim to set aside the referendum, mentioned that there can always be attempts again, that it's a living, breathing document, and that if the electorate are not necessarily satisfied, a new referendum can be brought, and that it's not a static document. So interestingly, in that case, you see the judiciary actually envisaging the possibility of people coming again, as it were, to a particular topic. The question as to whether there should be a minimum period for that to stand, that's a policy question that you would have to decide. But I think if anybody was looking at that, they would have to look at the judgment of the Supreme Court and Mr. Justice O'Donnell's decision in particular. It's in Jordan.
In Mr. Justice O'Donnell.
O'Donnell's, exactly. Because there's a question mark as to whether even that would be constitutional, I think. In other words, a prohibition on approaching at the same topic in a particular period of time. And then the second one is...
And what's the other time limit you were querying?
The pros and cons of implementing a decision by the...
Oh yes, whether there should be if authority is given as a result of a referendum to initiate legislation, should there be a time limit? And again, that I suppose is a matter of policy, but it'd be interesting to know your views on it.
It is a matter of policy, but my view is that it should take place within the lifetime of at least that government and the next government. Why I don't say the particular government is the government could fall before the legislation was given effect to, but I think beyond 2 parliaments not to implement the decision of the people in a referendum is basically treating the Constitution with contempt. And I would have thought that it should be, I would say 2 parliaments at a maximum, and there should be some sort of legislation giving effect to that.
And can I just add to that? There's again a policy decision as to whether you provide that generally in legislation for
Yeah.
every referendum,
Yeah.
or whether it should be simply in the bill which is setting out the proposed amendment to the Constitution, because it may be better to have a provision like that depending on the proposed amendment, so it's tailored, as it were.
Yeah, and not all across
Exactly.
the horizon, yeah.
It's
yeah,
a choice,
yeah.
but it's just, it's a
Yeah.
question perhaps for you to reflect on.
Yeah. Yes, now to table
Table 1.
one, yeah.
I'm the facilitator for Table 1, and the citizens at Table 1 have a question for Professor Murphy. What was the rationale for removing the ability of 50,000 citizens to request or to petition a referendum and giving the power instead to the Oireachtas?
In the 1922 Constitution, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in one way that goes to the heart of the mind of Eamon de Valera, which is not easily assessed. I think the idea of De Valera and his co-authors was to keep the dominance of Parliament. I think is important. That's the point in relation to then Parliament giving effect to the votes of the people at elections, and then that Parliament taking a decision on whether the Constitution should be changed. I think he was very strong on the primacy of Parliament, and I think that is the reason behind it. I think that would be an accepted view of scholars of the 1920s and the 1930s. Very important, I think, to reflect that the Constitution was written in a time of great upheaval in Europe, where democracy was a relatively fragile flower. You have the rise of both fascism and communism all across Europe at that stage. So I think he was very conscious of the primacy of Parliament, and that's the way I would assess it.
Niamh, do you want to add to that?
I think,
Yeah.
I think that's fine.
Yeah, yeah, thank you very much. Table 11, please.
Thank you, Judge. I'm the facilitator for Table 11, and the citizens at this table have 3 questions they'd like to put to the panel. The first question is it usual that legislation is published prior to a referendum being held, and if so, how long in advance would it usually be published? The second question is, what triggers the discussion at government to hold a referendum in the first place? Is there a particular process around that? And the third question is, why is it that a referendum is always held on just one day? Does this have to do with avoiding, or is this about establishing identification to avoid voter fraud? Could it not be spread over a longer period of time?
Yeah. That third question is something we'll return to later in the day, but about
Thank you,
your
Judge.
views on it. The publication of the
Yeah.
legislation, Niamh,
Yeah.
I think you've covered that in your paper.
Yeah, I mean, what happens is that the proposal goes before the Dáil, and then there is a bill passed by the Dáil, and then the Referendum Act says that after the bill is passed, there has to be a referendum between 30 and 90 days. So from the date it's passed by Dáil Éireann, it'll be available to the public to consider. And then, as I say, the referendum has to be brought about in that specified time period.
Yes.
There is a large debate about the triggering of referendums and whether we have too many referendums that couldn't be, that you couldn't have legislation for it instead. So there was a large debate in relation, for instance, to same-sex marriage, as distinct, could you possibly allow for that via legislation? So there's no easy answer to say what triggers a referendum. It would basically be a decision of Cabinet to try and persuade members of the Oireachtas to pass a bill amending the Constitution. Mostly it has champions. So divorce had a champion in terms of Dr. Fitzgerald and the Constitutional Crusade, as I said, in 1986. On the abortion referendums, most of these have had champions in Cabinet, and you can have pressures from outside. I think there is a large literature on the 8th Amendment and how there were significant external pressures put on the Oireachtas, all parties in the Oireachtas. But there's no easy answer beyond the fact that cabinet, we have a very centralised system of government in Ireland. We have, in many ways, a dominant government over the Dáil, although that's potentially changing because of the arithmetic. But that's basically how it works.
Would I be correct in summarising it as more politics than law?
I think you would, yeah. I would agree to that.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
the third question, just about the day, I don't
Yeah.
know why, but it is very clearly provided for in the Referendum Act that it shall be a polling day. It shall be not less than 12 hours, and it's between the hours of
Yeah.
8 a.m. and 10:30. So it's very clear that it is one day.
There's provision for islands, though, is there?
Oh yes, sorry, there is,
Yeah, yeah.
absolutely. There's the
Yeah.
usual type exceptions, but the main provision is one day.
Yeah, very good.
I think that there's been large debate about should you have voting at the weekends, both in referendums and the Dáil. Now you're going to discuss this later on.
Yeah.
I think the view politically has always been that it's just better to have one day, citizens have it in their heads and they
Yeah.
go to vote
Yeah.
on that day,
Yeah.
as distinct from having the luxury to say, oh, I think I'll vote tomorrow rather than today because it's raining or
But
whatever.
it is a topic we will return to, I think, later in the day.
Just, can I just check with Table 11? The question, your first question about legislation, were you asking not necessarily about the legislation to initiate the referendum, but any accompanying legislation, which would have been the case with, say, for example, the same-sex marriage referendum? Is that what was on your mind in that question? No, maybe not.
No, all right. Table?
Sorry, Judge, that was just, the question was just, does there have to be legislation in place
Oh, yes,
first?
yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Table 2, is it? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Judge. I'm the facilitator for Table 2. The citizens at Table 2 had a number of questions, most of which have been covered with
Yes.
answers from
Yeah,
other
yeah,
tables.
yeah.
Just, the citizens would like clarification just on one point. Are there any difference between the people who can vote in local and general elections and referendums?
I think the answer to this is, but I know Dr. Doyle will tell me, I think that only Irish citizens can vote in referenda. And I'm seeing nodding from the back of the hall, that's a good
Yeah.
sign.
Okay.
So I think that's the difference, and there may be other differences that perhaps some of the researchers could tell us about.
Yes,
Okay.
very good. Well, we might return to that, actually. Yeah.
Because they're citizens of the state that the Constitution guides.
Facilitator for Table 10.
Yeah.
The citizens of this table have 2 points of clarification. The first is, does the President have any involvement in the process before the question goes to the people before a referendum? And the second is there a time restriction for a petitioner to make a challenge to the result of a referendum?
The President doesn't have a role, as far as I'm aware, before it goes to the people. He signs the bill into law after it goes to the people, if it's been upheld. And in relation to the time, yes, there is. I think it's 7 days. It's extremely short. I'll just check the legislation, but the petition, the period within which you have to challenge the provisional referendum certificate is, I'm fairly sure it's 7 days. I'll come back to you if I'm wrong.
Yes, Table 9.
Sorry, hi. My name is Mike. I'm a member at Table 9. I have a question which I'd like to ask the question to both people, but to give some background to the question as well. Do you believe that corruption amongst the electoral register seriously undermines our ability to confidently conduct referendums in the first place? The background to that question being that I was reading, again, if it's bogus, I'd like you to clarify if it is, but in 2016 an investigation took place whereby the number of referendum voting cards printed was 200,000 higher than the number of citizens in the census of the same time for people over the age of 18. And then if you factor in that everyone who can vote doesn't vote, the degree of the error is enormous. And while I'm not looking for a perfect register, which isn't possible, but the extent to which the error exists potentially could undermine an actual vote on a given referendum where you have 49.5% versus 50.5% or something like that, which is something along the lines of some of the referendums have been very close. So surely, in order to avoid undermining the whole structure. This should be rectified. And as far as I'm aware, they're not doing much.
Yeah, so,
Gary, yes,
well, questioning the register of electors has been an ongoing obsession of many of us for many decades, and I think the department themselves would acknowledge that there is serious discrepancies in the register, and some will have seen doubts about in the same-sex marriage referendum people coming home to vote who shouldn't have been on the register because they had lived outside the state for over a certain period of time. There is a solution to this, in my view, which is the creation of an electoral commission, which would have responsibility for the conduct of all referendums, the register, and elections. And myself and some of my colleagues at the back of the room have called for this for many years, and it hasn't happened. But I think you have to have the trust in those who do vote in relation to the outcome of referendums. But I don't think there's any doubt that the fact that the register isn't as accurate as we as citizens would like it to be does cause some significant disquiet in both in government circles, and it should cause some disquiet for citizens as well.
Yeah.
And I'd just add one thing. I mentioned that there was in the Referendum Act the legal grounds for challenging the outcome of a referendum, and one of those grounds is the commission of an offence referred to in the Electoral Act. But obviously subject to the caveat that it still has to materially affect the outcome.
Yeah. Very good. Any other question? Yeah. Very well. Well, we'll call this part of it a day at this stage. And once again, I want to thank both Gary and Niamh for most helpful. And again, at the risk of boring you, I'm going to say read the papers. And I would just particularly with Niamh's last observation in relation to the Act. It's there. She has it set out in her paper, and it's just crystal clear. So you'll learn an awful lot from reading the papers. Thank you very, very much.